All right.
Cool. Cheers.
Cheers.
Welcome back to another episode of Cocktails with Creatives. Today, I invite a friend and colleague, Neal Endicott. Neal is a composer and music theorist who has similar research areas as me. Specifically, we've both been working a lot in the music theory pedagogy arena. Neal recently is a published author, so we're super excited about that. And Neal, what are we drinking today?
We are drinking Americanos, which is a sort of classic aperitif cocktail. Origins in Italy, despite the name. One of my favorites, I love all things Campari, which is basically what the drink is. It's Campari and sweet vermouth. Campari, sweet vermouth, with the optional addition of club soda or some other sort of sparkling water. Just, light, tasty, refreshing, a little bit bitter, which is great. Yeah, I love them.
Yeah, no, I will say it's about 5:20 right now, and I feel like this is the perfect type of drink for the time of hour that it is. I was in Italy last summer, and not the previous summer, and we had pre-COVID summer, and we had one of these most early evenings. So absolutely excited to enjoy one of these with Neal. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, do all the things, share the video. And we're just gonna have a conversation today. It's gonna be very casual. So thank you for being on here, Neal.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So Neal, we both do pedagogy work, and I'm curious, why pedagogy? Why are you interested in pedagogy?
It's one of those things that when I started taking the classes at MSU, because I did my master's in music theory there, which you are still doing, currently still finishing up. It's something that I hadn't particularly thought about prior to taking the courses. I was working on the degree because I wanted to be able to teach music theory, and sort of starting to read about pedagogy and getting me to think, why do we teach things the way we do? Why do we teach the topics that we do? And trying to not only get to the bottom of that, but also to think about, is the way that we teach music theory the best way to teach music theory? Are the topics we include in music theory the topics we should be including in music theory? And the sort of inevitable conclusion of that train of thought is, what are things that we can do better? How do we improve the quality of teaching we're giving to undergraduates? How do we make the topics we bring into the classroom more relevant, more applicable to what students are going to be doing in their careers? How do we make the material more engaging? Because I'm coming from the perspective as a composer where a lot of the stuff that typically falls under the umbrella of music theory is already fascinating to me, like figuring out how a piece is put together, trying to draw conclusions about why a composer might have done what they did, how that relates to other works. All of that sort of stuff is fascinating to me already, and I want to find ways to help other people get there, because it's something that I find incredibly valuable as a tool. And if we do a better job as theory teachers, our students will be more engaged. They'll hopefully continue to be curious and investigate things on their own, and just end up being better rounded musicians in the end.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny because Neal and I probably have more in common than almost anybody else that would be on this show, in the sense that we're both saxophonists, we're both composers, we both will have finished masters in music theory from Michigan State University. And I think, and we're both interested in pedagogy work. And I'm wondering if your background as a saxophonist as well is relevant in this conversation. For me, I've always, I look at the saxophone repertoire, and the majority of like other than a couple of like the really famous ones from like Glazunov or in the various pieces of repertoire that happened maybe every decade after that, like the large portion of the saxophone community is like a new music haven. And you go to a NASA conference or World Sax Congress or anything like that, and it's basically a giant new music festival. So I'm curious how, if you're, a lot of the way that you think about pedagogy and whatnot is related to that as well.
I think it is. I definitely, that was my background coming into college, was in not necessarily the super avant-garde saxophone music because I was in high school, but still decidedly post-tonal in a lot of ways what I was playing. That and a mix of that and jazz and concert band music was basically my knowledge of music. And then to go into university setting and to be taking a class where none of that music was discussed almost at all, sort of it was hard for me to engage with the music we were talking about in music theory. And I think it's to a much, much lesser degree a matter of representation and the way that we talk about we want to be bringing in music by composers of diverse backgrounds, music in diverse styles, music that represents different sound worlds, different cultures, so that everyone who's taking the class can see that it's relevant to them. Seeing the music that you're playing, music that you're interested represented in that coursework is part of that equation. And so it definitely made me, it helped when I got interested in pedagogy to sort of spur me in, particularly in the direction that I ended up going with my research. I think at the time it probably just made me antagonistic towards music theory as a whole. And when I started composing, that evolved.
Yeah, I get that. And, I think I've been thinking a lot about repertoire though. And I know you mentioned that, the different types of pieces that people can see their own musical practices in, and trying to diversify that. But I think it can be really challenging because the hard part about music theory is if we try to teach something for everybody, we don't teaching very much. And if we try to only teach one type of set of rules, then we're excluding a lot of things. And so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is more agency and also giving students tools to make analytical claims for really anything, whether or not they truly understand the music. And what I mean by that is, do you have the ability to look at something from any culture, any style, and be able to make a comment about basic fundamentals of musical practice, such as, can you talk about something interesting from the rhythm? Can you talk about something interesting from, timbre and pitch and stuff like that? And if you're interested, then you can go and learn more about that music. And I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on giving students more agency in what they're learning, as a method of learning more, or as a way to help them figure out what they want to learn more about. Because I feel like so much of the music theory classroom is, here's a repertoire that we've decided is relevant, And even in some of your work, like you've made choices about repertoire, right? And I'm not saying your choices of repertoire have been wrong or anything like that, because I think that it's really great repertoire that you've chosen, and it's all repertoire that I really like. But I wonder about, just because it's repertoire you like doesn't necessarily mean it's relevant to students. You know what I mean?
Right. I definitely agree, and this has come up in a lot of discussions I've had with people, is the whole breadth versus depth issue, and talking about repertoire choice. And from my perspective, the goal of undergraduate music theory, that like core curriculum, is that it's a survey course. What it should do is it should build a solid foundation of knowledge and give students tools that they can use to explore repertoire on their own. And so our job as instructors is to present as great a variety of repertoire as we can in the classroom, so that students can be exposed to as many different musics as we can bring in. And that what we're doing is we're not saying, this is how we study the music of Lutoslawski or the music of Takemitsu or the music of whoever, or in the traditional sense, this is how we study the music of Beethoven. What we're doing is we're saying, here are analytical devices, here are tools that you can use to approach music, just on a broad level. Things like, pattern recognition, being able to talk about timbre and texture, being able to talk about form beyond just, I can label this as a sectional ternary form. Well, that's fine, but what does it actually mean? What are the implications of that? What we want to be doing is giving students the tools so that they can then, when they encounter a piece that is nothing like what they've looked at in music theory classroom, or what they've worked on in their lessons before or in ensembles before, that they have some sort of toolbox that they can draw on to be able to approach what is a new sound to them. And so, like,
I love the word toolbox.
That it's something that I think about a lot in teaching composition, and more I think about in teaching theory as well. That it's not so much a set of rules that we should be giving students to memorize, which is kind of the standard issue approach to teaching music theory, but it should be the tools that students can use to recognize recurring patterns, to recognize the things that we now call rules. That, ideally speaking, a student should be able to, after analyzing a bunch of, say, Bach, realize, he doesn't use parallel fifths, not just don't write parallel fifths, which is sort of the standard issue example of something we hammer into students as a rule. That is in no way a rule. It is a recognized practice of music in a certain very narrow style from a relatively short period of time, and a very specific geographic origin, right? It's a rule of music written in Austria and Germany between 17 and 1900. Just not a lot of music when you think about music as a global phenomenon.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that when we hammer into this idea of rules, as opposed to these are stylistic things that occur in a type of music that we can talk about, if that is the type of music that we're talking about, then I think that's helpful to think about. I've been recently incorporating this idea of elements of composition into my own pedagogical practices, where I have my students make a list of every single term that they can possibly think of that goes into their own music making practice. And my list right now is like 90 words or something like that. And there's way more words than that. Those are just the 90 words that I've thought of that are relevant. And some of them are as simple as like pitch and rhythm, and some of them are more abstract, although maybe not abstract, but like is there an audience involved, and is there what is the word spectral role is on my list, but like might not be on a student's list because that might not be important to them. But by having this like metacognitive study or metacognitive exercise that I have my students do, they are now thinking more analytically about their own music making practices. And I'm wondering if some of these words may or may not get spoken about during an undergraduate curriculum, and we tend to offload a lot of the more, I'm going to use the word crunchy music, to graduate school, which means that a large portion of students, particularly maybe like the music ed students who may or may not go to grad school, or if they do, what they're studying might be different than what other people are studying, which then leads them to, like, we're talking about band repertoire now, right? If we talk about band repertoire is so much repertoire is written in the last like 20 years. And if we look at where band is headed, it's so much more open-minded, I think, to different types of music. Yet I feel like a lot of the music in band totally gets ignored in theory curriculums. And I'm curious if you've thought about this at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, I talked a little bit about representing different repertoires. It's for, especially at big public universities like MSU, or I did not necessarily big public university, but I did my undergrad at Western Michigan University. Big portions of that student body are people who do band. Music ed is, I don't know if it's the biggest major at a lot of universities, but it's a sizable chunk of the student population who major in music. And then add on to that, anyone who's in saxophone performance, low brass performance, high brass performance, even percussion, they're band people. There's some crossover with orchestra, but they're, generally speaking, a lot of them do band. And there's so much repertoire that even if you don't, this is sort of going into my research wheelhouse, even if you don't change the way we structure the music theory curriculum, if all you're doing is changing what pieces you bring into the classroom, you can bring in band pieces all over the place. Like when you think about, whether it's in the areas of fundamentals, if you're talking about syncopation or you're talking about hemiola, how many band pieces can you name off the top of your head that feature those elements? When you're talking about different types of texture, when you're talking about keys and scales, when you're talking about basic forms, and some of those you can get into some pretty crunchy music. I just randomly came up on my phone the other day as just listening to stuff. Karel Hussa's Scherzo it's a scherzo. It is a ternary piece. It is clearly a ternary piece, but it's also, an undergraduate music student would probably classify it as pretty crunchy. It is, I'd have to look at the score. It is decidedly not tonal in the common practice sense, but would be a great classroom example, and brings in band repertoire, modernizes it, but introduces students to a composer who many of them have probably never heard of. And there's plenty of topics in it. There's all sorts of opportunities to do stuff like that all through the curriculum, as opposed to constantly coming back to compositions by the same 4 or 5 composers and compositions for the same 2 or 3 instrumentations. If you go through a lot of this sort of standard classroom examples, it's piano piece, string quartet, art song, piano piece, more piano, symphony, but reduced for piano. Bringing in band repertoire is a way to, at the very least, add a little bit of variation to things.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've also been thinking a little bit about just like context. How cool would it be to if the wind band or wind department, in like concert band or wind ensemble or whatever your university calls your various band, if they're playing a piece and then that piece shows up in class in the theory area, like in a collaborative sort of way, all of a sudden the student is being taught something that is relevant to what is actually happening in their own music making practice. It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm just going to use MSU as an example. It doesn't make any sense to me that the majority of the repertoire that we use is piano repertoire, and there's maybe like 3 undergraduate piano students at MSU.
It definitely is. It's a wasted opportunity. There's so much good repertoire in band and orchestra, in music that gets performed in studios, and choir repertoire too. I have a tendency to leave choir out because I don't sing, but there's great examples that you can bring in. And if students are being asked to look analytically at music that they are performing, you can show them how the analysis of that music can lend insight, can improve or enhance, or whatever word you want to use, their performance, how it can make that topic that would otherwise be very abstract, it makes that real. And even if it's not pieces that they're actively playing, if it's pieces that, when we look at the sort of standard examples we draw on, it's, Beethoven piano sonatas and classical symphonies. If you're a string major or a piano major, you're going to play those pieces at some point, and it can be useful to have that understanding. In the same respect that, spend some time with the Holst suites. How many band kids are going to play those pieces at some point or conduct them at some point? Spend some time with, getting even into like really modern stuff. When the MSU bands played Omar Thomas's Come Sunday, like how much of that piece could you bring into the music theory classroom? There's great stuff in there, and you can spend time with it and have fun and learn more about that piece. And when you have living composers, I am sure any of the theory faculty could have gotten Omar to zoom in to one of their classes and talk about his music. Like, I know I love talking about my music with people, and like, I don't know any living composer who would not jump at the opportunity to pick apart their piece with a room of kids who are interested in their music. And it just seems it's a wasted opportunity, frankly.
I totally agree. I really do. You brought up something that I think makes a really good point, though, about expanding what actually gets taught and the order of how things get taught, though. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, though, on that, because there's the idea of bringing in repertoire that applies directly to things that we're already teaching in the way that we're already teaching. And then there's the idea of bringing in repertoire that maybe doesn't do any of the things that currently gets taught in a music theory curriculum. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, this is something that was a big part of a discussion I presented in my research at Music Theory Midwest, and I was sharing a panel with theory faculty from the University of Dayton who we were sort of presenting on research papers that were those two sides of it's not really a divide, it's just different strategies for doing similar things, where my research was on, here are things that you can do without necessarily having to, or without having the authority to change the curriculum. It's changing the examples you use, versus the U Dayton people were talking about a pretty dramatic curricular redesign. And I think, based on a lot of what I've been reading this summer about what the sort of broader discussion has been in the music theory community, I think that ultimately a large-scale curricular design is going to need to happen. That some of the flaws of the way we teach music theory are too deeply ingrained in the topics we teach and the order we teach them. But that being said, that's a huge task, because that is, something that, one, you need theory faculty at multiple universities to be on board with. You need to have them get the rest of their department on board with it. And then you need to completely scrap your existing syllabus, your existing course structure, all of the exams and homework examples and other assignments that you've used for probably years. And you need to scrap your textbook. And is there a textbook that doesn't approach the curricular structure in approximately the same way? Maybe, but you have to go hunting for it, or you might have to write your own textbook, dude. So this is a thing that is years in the making that, I think we kind of have to start doing it at some point soon. But there are also intermediary steps that you can take to sort of affect change more instantaneously, which is the swapping out classroom examples, maybe minimizing certain repertoire, finding more opportunities to dive outside of the art music world, but ultimately on the way to a curriculum that equalizes the importance of different types of music.
Yeah. Wow. You said a lot of things that are really, really interesting to me. And I think it actually brings me back to my main, one of my main arguments from my response to Adam Neely's video, which was that I think that most composition or most theory departments should actually bring on, whenever they do their next, hiring of a tenure track position, whenever that will be, that they should be, instead of hiring another Schenker person or another whatever, they should hire someone whose specific research area of interest is music theory pedagogy. And their job...
I would be very happy with that.
I know you would, and I'd be happy with it too. And maybe this is a little selfish because this is our research area, but it's actually the reason that they need to be hiring someone whose specific job is to research music theory pedagogy is to do this work, because as you've described, it's a large undertaking. And quite frankly, people who are in music theory already have research areas that they're interested in. And I think that they should be allowed to continue those research areas. How many universities in this country have someone who's a dedicated music theory pedagogy researcher, and that's what they do, that's what they spend their time on? How many schools can you think of that have that?
I mean, there are plenty of schools that have people who, that's maybe not their primary area, but I know, being at MSU, most of our theory faculty have a vested interest in pedagogy. I definitely think that it's something that needs to be emphasized to a greater degree. And I also think that when you think about the time commitment portion of it, a lot of tenure track faculty, their job is to, on one hand, teach, and on the other hand, do research. And you and I, presumably, when we get tenure track jobs, have the benefit of our research can be composition in most instances. That's our area of research. But I'm curious to know, and I really don't have the answer here, how many music departments, how many universities would consider curricular redesign to be research activity? Because that, having someone dedicate 20, 30, 40% of their time on the job to rethinking and redesigning the curriculum is a worthwhile endeavor. And that's probably the amount of time it would take. But you need to you need a university that's going to say, yeah, that counts as research activity. Like, it's not necessarily going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. You might present on it at conferences, which the two scholars from the University of Dayton, they presented their redesigned curriculum as research at Music Theory Midwest, which is great and really, really educational and spawned some great discussion. But I don't know, and I probably should have asked them if that redesign counted as their research activity, or if that was something that they had to do in their presumably fairly limited spare time. Because it is a massive investment of time and effort, and probably a lot of bureaucratic headaches. And
yeah, and it's true. And the bureaucratic headaches, I think, is really one of the largest issues here. And you make a really good point, particularly the faculty at Michigan State, who do have an invested interest in music theory pedagogy. I also know composition faculty at MSU who have a very invested interest in composition pedagogy, which to not get down that rabbit hole, because that's a much bigger conversation for another time. There are people who are interested in these things, but they really can't devote the time because the tenure process is what it is. And until that systemic issue is changed or evaluated, I don't know. It's really challenging. And I think you bring up a really good point of asking the question, could curricular redesign be considered research for the purposes of the tenure process?
Which I certainly think if you can manage to turn it into a paper, it's research activity, which you may or may not be able to do, or if you can turn it into a presentation at the conference. So I think what it takes people who want to do that, getting hired by programs that are amenable to them spending their time doing that, and then programs that are also willing to then implement some of those changes, because that becomes then the next step. Is it's one thing for someone to sit in isolation and say, this would be a great music theory curriculum. I think this would solve a bunch of problems. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write the new textbook. I'm going to get the copyright permissions I need to get, which that's a whole thing. And I'm going to do all of this work. Their program then needs to be willing to say, yeah, we are going to completely change what we're actually doing with our students. Like, because you have to take it from an abstract idea to actually teaching it. And you have to give that time to take effect and to see if those changes are worth it and if they work, and you have to redesign it. Like, this is what I'm saying. It's the work of years and years and years.
It is. I will say, you just said something that it totally popped in my mind just now about the getting copyright permissions for things. I have the solution for that. We don't have to use quote unquote famous composers in textbooks. And quite frankly, if you're writing a textbook, and let's only include people who are pre-tenure in these books, and that counts as research and it counts as getting published and could count to, someone pre-tenure could put that in their CV, that their music, their composition is published in a textbook. That is, totally something. And, we don't have, it's not that composers shouldn't get paid, because I believe in composers getting paid, but if they're getting paid to be at an institution, and we're not asking for them to include, to have to write a whole piece, or we're not even asking them to include whole pieces. We're asking about excerpts.
It does run into, I'm really committed to, as much as possible, using not necessarily famous repertoire, but engaging with bigger chunks of pieces, which that doesn't need to be what goes in textbooks. And it's funny you mentioned younger composers. I was getting copyright permissions for the paper I'm getting published. I think in January it's coming out. And with a couple of the composers whose works I reference in the paper, my initial strategy for I need copyright permission was just email the composers. And in a couple of those cases, I assumed that they were self-published. I thought they were self-published and that all I would need was, yeah, go ahead, Neal, that sounds great. And it was, nope, even they have like a copyright holder who I need to get permission from. And it's a whole complicated thing. And even in cases where the composer may be very, very on board, they have to get their publisher on board. And if you're writing a textbook to be published, you're going to have two publishers butting heads, and it's a whole thing.
Yeah, I'm sure it really is. And I just think that I think that comes down to, quite frankly, if the publisher is going to get in the way, then you know how many composers there are in the world and how many people are self-published composers that don't have that. Or like in my case, like I have a publisher who happens to also be a music theorist and wouldn't care. And so like, you know, making relationships with composers. And I think that that's kind of the point that I'm making is making relationships with people. Because I also think that there's something really great about having a relationship with the composer that then you're teaching about. For instance, and I have two really, really great examples. Probably one of my favorite examples that I use is Alex Temple's The Man Who Hated Everything. It's a really great piece. Alex is a friend. I sent her a note and said, hey, this piece is available on your website. Can I use it for this lesson? And she's like, yeah, let me help you. And she actually told me, like, told me some of the analysis and saved me a whole lot of time. Cause she's like, yeah, totally. Let's make that happen. On that same note, having relationships with people and then bringing them into the classroom. Just today at MSU in the comp area, they brought in Kristen Custer from the University of Michigan, who is my teacher's teacher. Like, they have this relationship, and to see that relationship, but then how it's evolved from student teacher to, professional, is something that I think is really valuable to students. And maybe it's not directly related to composition or music theory or whatever, but there's that extra, like, hey, this is where my relationships could go. And, that is valuable too in a music theory curriculum. And I think we forget that teaching a class isn't always necessarily about the skills taught in said class. There are other skills that are learned through just university education. Sorry, that was my ramble.
No, it's a worthwhile ramble. And I think it's sort of in the vein of thoughts triggering thoughts. The other thing that I tend to think about in teaching is it's sort of an old-fashioned attitude that you hear come up every now and then, that the music we use as examples in theory class should be the best possible examples, right? That we have a duty to present works by geniuses and we present the master works, the works of the canon. And the corollary to that is then the assumption that if you choose a work to present in a music theory classroom, you are inherently making the case that it is a masterwork. And I try to steer away from that, because sometimes the works that are the best examples of a particular concept, or that are the most amenable to analysis by undergraduates, by amateurs, by people who are still learning the skill set, those works aren't necessarily the best pieces of music that have ever been written, or are not necessarily representative of a composer's broader catalog, but they are good examples to use in the classroom because students can draw conclusions based on them. They can learn things from them. They can learn how to apply different tools. Sorry, my cat is rustling a paper bag right now.
Neal, what do you hope for the future of this field?
Broadly speaking, I want the work that people are doing right now in the area of pedagogy, and particularly the people who are, in whatever way they're trying to do it, to modernize and counteract the problems of the way we teach music theory now. People who are working towards any sort of solutions in that area. I want to see that work continue. I want to see it sort of emerge from concept into practice in the classroom. I want to see the field of music theory continue to embrace more kinds of music and to ask students to challenge themselves in more ways. I want to see, and there are promising signs. There are a lot of trends in the way music theory is being taught in a lot of places, and in the research of a lot of people who are doing great work. There's a lot of promising things, and I want to see that continue and to expand and to be welcomed by the rest of the musical community. And you have to have that become the norm, and have the industry and the academy put their weight behind that work, because I really strongly believe that it's completely vital. It has to get done, and it's not going to get done when there are barriers to it. But
yeah, I think the idea of barriers, removing barriers, I think, to make this work possible is really I think the first that next step. I mean, I think you're right. A lot of people are starting to include more works by women and people of color, and that's definitely a good start. But removing barriers to allow for curricular redesign, I think is important. And I really appreciate having you as being part of this work. A short anecdote before we close. Shortly after Cardi B came out with her song, I remember Neal posting about wanting to include this in the curriculum now, or he would teach this in a class, and people were like, "I want to take that class," and I think
I figured out how I do it.
How I have to hear.
So I've been working on, as part of job applications, I'm designing syllabi for various courses that I would like to teach or be prepared to teach. And I've put together a pretty detailed music appreciation syllabus. And one of the weeks of my proposed course would be, or one of the lessons would be, discussing various features of hip hop, and a lesson in which students will listen to a number of pieces, WAP being one of them, and compare the way that male and female sexuality and sexual prowess and sexual power is represented in hip hop and in popular music in general. Because it's a great example of that, because that's why people got annoyed or upset by that piece, was that it's a piece where two women are exploring their sexual power and being open about their sexual power, which is great. And the fact that it upsets people amuses me, because it's pretty benign, all things considered. And it's a fun piece of music, and it is potential to spawn a great conversation about how we talk about sexuality in music, which is a conversation that can go in art music. You can talk about it in hip hop. You can talk about it in rock and pop and whatever genre. It comes up everywhere, and it then asks, if you're asking students to talk about it, it asks them to think critically about something that they probably gloss over in their everyday listening. Like, how often do those topics come up in music and we just sort of ignore them until Cardi B makes you pay attention to it?
How to think more critically about music 101. That should be what music theory 101 is how to think more critically about it. But you know, I think you've brought up some really wonderful points, and I wish that if we could just like keep talking and talk and talk and talk and talk. But I think that that's a good place. I'll probably invite Neal back on sometime because he's also a really wonderful cook, and so I'm sure he'd love to be on my cooking version of the show at some point. And we can keep having these conversations. Neal, where can people find out more about your work, your music, your theory stuff, everything?
You can go to my website, which is nealendicottmusic.com. Keep an eye out for the forthcoming issue of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy, where a paper will be published. If you want to see me make things with bees, follow me on Instagram, because I do a lot of that. Yeah. I also have a SoundCloud that is infrequently updated.
Hey, we all. Neal, this was really a great conversation, and it's an important conversation, and it's nice to be able to have a conversation with someone who we've read a lot of the same work. We've, you know, his paper, I've read almost every source that's in his paper just because it's in my own research. So thank you for having such a great conversation, and I look forward to seeing your published work.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good night.
You too.